folks, and welcome to the program. My name is John Feakes. I'm the lead pastor of New Life Sanctuary Church in Winnipeg. And this is going to be part 5 in our series going through our Bible Evidence Museum located in the lower level of the New Life Sanctuary Church building. And where we left off in the last program, we were looking at the Earth's geological features. And remember now, those features can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. Now, for the Bible believer, God made the earth in 6 days, and he did it like 6,000 years ago. And that original very good world was smashed and destroyed, first through the entrance of sin and the resulting curse on the planet, and then in a spectacular, supernatural, global catastrophe called the Genesis flood. And we feel that a flood of that magnitude, with that much water sloshing over the globe, that's really going to leave a mark geologically, and we think that it did. And we were looking at some of the evidence for that. Of course, our chief competitor philosophically in this would be the Darwinian account of things, which says that the Earth's geological features, by and large, can be interpreted by way of slow, uniform process. Just slow, uniform processes operating over endless ages of time. So you have a catastrophist view of Earth history espoused by the biblical creationist, or you have a more uniformitarian view of Earth history, which is the foundation for Darwinism. And in the last couple programs, we were looking at those rocks and fossils, the strata layers, the canyons, and those such things. And we were seeing that what we're looking at can be much better interpreted as the result of a recent aquatic catastrophe and post-flood catastrophism. Remember, there are various ways you can tie those strata layers together to compress all this supposed geological history. Those strata layers are horizontal in nature. There's very little chemical or physical erosion between those layers. They look like just regular bedding planes. And yet, in some cases, there's supposed to be millions of years in between those layers. Some of those layers actually go right across the ocean. The Depeat sandstone in the Grand Canyon picks up again over in Israel. That looks worldwide in scope. Delicate surface features like raindrops or ripple marks or footprints, you can spot those in some of those rock layers. Indicates that the layer was laid down quickly and buried quickly. Some of those layers, you'll see them running horizontally all together, parallel, and all of a sudden they take a quick bend upward, all of them together, and there's no cracking. Obviously, those layers were laid down by water. They were still unconsolidated. They were still even perhaps wet when a compressive force was applied, and those layers, all of a sudden now they take a sharp bend upward, sometimes almost 90 degrees upwards, okay? So those are ways that you can tie those layers together. In the last program, we looked at a very interesting way you can tie those layers together, and that was the polystrate fossils that you see in the world. You know, fossil trees now standing bolt upright in the rock layers, sometimes spanning many different layers. You know, there's one tree in the United States that actually spans 2 layers of coal. Coal, we are told, takes maybe hundreds of millions of years to form. And this particular fossil tree runs through 2 layers of coal with different rock layers in between. So obviously, it doesn't require millions of years for rock layers to be laid down, or sediment to be laid down and then to lithify and become rock. Does not necessarily take millions of years. Now, we ended the last program, we were looking at radiometric dating, and I encourage you to look at that program and get some information on radiometric dating, and we don't want to rehash all that right now. But something interesting that we should talk about, this is an interesting book here. This was written by Robert Gentry a few years ago now. And Robert Gentry was an employee of the U.S. government. And he was in charge of nuclear waste disposal and that kind of thing. And so he is an expert when it comes to atomic processes. And in that book, he reveals what he calls a tiny mystery, which is actually a big mystery, a big problem for anyone who wants to espouse an ancient age for the Earth, an Earth in the order of 4.6 billion years. And what Gentry points out is that when uranium decays into lead, we looked at this in the last program, uranium goes through a number of transitional isotopic forms before it finally becomes lead. You know, it becomes different lighter elements until it becomes lead. Now, one of those elements that it becomes is polonium-218. And it becomes polonium-218 from radon-222. So that's part of the decay series, part of the decay chain as uranium decays into lead. Now, the polonium, when it decays, it blasts a halo in the rock around it. There is a release of energy and it burns a signature halo. And in fact, that's what's on the cover of Gentry's book there. You can see that signature halo, and he's got photographs of some of those halos on the back of his book. Now, the interesting thing is, we know that polonium was the result of radioisotopic decay. We know that. And we know how long each one of those transitional isotopes lasts. We know what the half-life of those isotopes are. The interesting thing about these polonium-218 halos is that they don't have any parent halo around them. The radon halo is not there. And to make a long story short, and I just encourage you to do some further research into this, but to make a long story short, the rocks around the world in the granite, we're talking about granite now, granite rocks around the world are chock full of orphan polonium halos. And Gentry's conclusion to this, the only thing that makes sense to him, is that those rocks were once molten and they instantaneously solidified, at least within 3 minutes. So the molten rock could not contain the radon halo, but it could contain the polonium halo, and it has. So he wants to say that granite rocks are Genesis rock. They are the original rock that God brought into existence right at the dawn of creation. He has no problem with those rocks being molten, but they would have had to have solidified within 3 minutes, and that requires a supernatural miracle. Now, is Gentry correct in this? I honestly don't know. Those guys that worked on the RATE project, I think they concluded something different. The point is, we don't know enough about radioisotopic decay to be sure that radiometric dating is a reliable way to date the rocks and the fossils. We just don't know enough about it. And those orphan halos are proof positive we don't know enough about it. There are various ways that we can interpret those orphan halos. And right now the jury's out, okay? But it is a mystery. That's kind of the point there. We do have a genuine mystery on our hands here, okay? Now, I do want to keep going forward here, and we do want to talk about carbon-14 dating, because that's the next question you're going to get hit with. If you're a young Earth creationist and you communicate to somebody that the Bible teaches the Earth is only 6,000 years old, sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later, someone's going to mention radiometric dating. We covered a bit of that in the last program. And or C14 dating, which is a kind of radiometric dating technique, kind of, sort of, okay? Now, once again, anyone who says to you that carbon-14 dating proves that the Earth is billions of years old really doesn't understand the dating process. They do not understand the technique. Because carbon-14 dating cannot in any way bring down the conclusion that the Earth is in the order of billions of years old. Radiometric dating, or rather C14 dating, if C14 dating can be relied upon at all, the best it'll get you is an Earth that is perhaps 50 or 60 or maybe 100,000 years old. It cannot by itself bring down the conclusion that the Earth is in the order of billions, and that's important to get that, okay? So, how does C14 dating work? Well, in a nutshell, if I could just sort of do this concisely, I'll do my best. C14 dating is built upon the idea that in our atmosphere, we do have various elements, and one of them is nitrogen. Now, radiation from space hits this nitrogen, and it knocks some things around, and basically nitrogen is converted into radioactive carbon, or carbon-14. So now in our atmosphere, we have radioisotopic carbon-14, which is unstable and is decaying, and you also have stable carbon-12. So two different kinds of carbon now in the atmosphere. Carbon-14, which is radioactive, and stable carbon-12. Both forms of carbon mix with oxygen to create CO2. And the plants of the earth breathe in the CO2, and they make it part of their structure. Okay? Now, the plant now therefore has carbon-14 in its system, as well as stable carbon-12, and animals eat the plants, and animals make that plant material part of their own bodies. So the idea is that the atmosphere has a certain ratio in it between carbon-14 and carbon-12. The plants have that same ratio, as do the animals that eat the plants. Okay? But you can imagine what's going on. Carbon-14 in the atmosphere is decaying, and carbon-14 in the plants is decaying, carbon-14 in the animals is decaying. But it's constantly being replenished, right, from the environment. But when the animal or the plant dies, it ceases to take in this radioactive carbon-14, and whatever's in its system, it continues to decay. So the idea is, if you dig up an animal or a plant, used to be alive, now it's dead, and you find only a very tiny bit of C14 left in that animal or plant, but a whole lot of C12 by comparison, the idea is now that you have a very, very old specimen, right? Because it's taken a long time for that C14 to have decayed. So you're looking for that ratio between C12 and C14. And scientists watching C14 decay in the laboratory have now concluded that the half-life of C14 is about 5,730 years. In other words, if you had a pound, let's say you had a pound or a certain quantity of C14, in 5,730 years, half of it would be gone. It would have decayed away. That's the half-life of C14. And so the reasoning seems very sound, doesn't it? We know how fast this decays. Dig up an animal or plant that has died. Check to see how much C14 is still in that animal or plant. Check that ratio between C14 and C12, and you have a pretty good idea of when the animal or plant died. Again, though, you've got to make some serious assumptions, don't you? You have to assume to know that the rate of decay has not changed. And I think that there's some pretty good evidence out there to show that the rate of isotopic decay has, or at least can, change. I mean, this is a huge assumption to think that you're going to go back 50, 60, or 100,000 years, assuming that in all that time there's been no change to the rate of isotopic decay. And again, in the last program, we saw some pretty interesting and I think compelling evidence to show that the rate of decay can and actually has changed. Okay. You also have to, when it comes to C14 dating, you also have to know what that ratio of C12 to C14 was in the unobserved past. And there's no way we could possibly know that. When the technique was first developed, scientists assumed that that ratio between C12 and C14 in the atmosphere was stable. Why did they think that? Because they assumed, capital A, assumed that the Earth was in the order of billions of years old. See? It works like this. The amount of C14 being created in the atmosphere is actually growing. We're actually building C14 in the atmosphere, even as we speak. Now, the idea was that the rate of loss of C14 was equal to the rate of creation of C14. And maybe you've heard of the bucket analogy. This might help you to understand the bucket analogy. If you had a bucket and you had holes drilled from the bottom of the bucket going upward, holes drilled in your bucket, and you were pouring water into the bucket, the water would hit the first hole and begin leaking out, wouldn't it? But the water level might continue to rise in your bucket until it hits the second hole and then it leaks out. And it may continue yet to rise until it hits the third hole. But at a certain point, you're going to reach equilibrium, where the amount of water going in is going to equal the amount of water going out. Now, scientists have looked at this and they concluded that if you took a brand new planet Earth with no C14 in the atmosphere, and all things being equal, it would take roughly 30,000 years for us to reach equilibrium. That is to say, the amount of C14 being created would equal the amount of C14 being lost through decay. 30,000 years. It turns out we're only about a third of the way there. The amount of C14 is still growing in the atmosphere. So that's a pretty good indicator that the Earth is not billions of years old, but less than 10,000 years old, because the rate of C14 is growing and we haven't hit that equilibrium point yet. See, I think that's probably pretty important to note that, okay? But the other thing is, you've got to assume that there was no large-scale aquatic catastrophe, i.e. the Genesis flood, because the Genesis flood would have uprooted, torn up, buried all those massive pre-flood forests, thereby absolutely altering the carbon inventory in this planetary system. And if you don't take into account the Genesis flood, and you just argue in strict uniformitarian fashion, you're going to come up with dates that are wrong, aren't you? You know? And Walt Brown, again, I recommend Walt Brown's fantastic book, In the Beginning. You can just go to creationscience.com. He has a whole article on that topic. Answersingenesis.org or ICR.org or creation.com. They have a lot of information on this topic here. But the fact of the matter is, carbon-14 is not a surefire way to date anything. Again, wild dates are frequently obtained, and accepted dates are really selected dates. Fewer than 50% of the dates that you get through the radiocarbon dating method, fewer than 50% are actually accepted by the researchers. That's important to note that. And scientists, in candid moments, they'll even admit it for you. Accepted dates or selected dates. And again, you got to go to the geologic column, which is somebody's idea about Earth history, to check to see if your radiometric dates are accurate or not. There was a Neanderthal fossil, the Amid 1 Neanderthal fossil skull that was discovered. And radiometric dating techniques were applied to the skull, and the date came back less than 6,000 years old, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 years old, and immediately that skull was deemed to have been contaminated. You see, that's the ace in the hole. When you apply a radiometric dating technique, whether it's uranium to lead or rubidium to strontium or potassium to argon, or if you're going to use the carbon-14 dating technique, whenever you get a date you don't like, whenever you get a date that is completely out of step with the geologic column, you just can immediately come up with an excuse. You can say, well, the sample was contaminated. Something leached in or something leached out. But don't you see, with the radiocarbon dating technique, you actually destroy part of your sample. So before you apply the technique, you want to be pretty sure that your sample has not been contaminated. Like, for example, the Neanderthal skull. You're not going to use the radiocarbon dating technique if you have any suspicion that your sample's been contaminated, right? Nevertheless, whenever you get a date you don't like, you can always claim contamination. Now, the really interesting thing about the C14 dating technique is that you really should not find any radiocarbon in supposedly ancient bones. For example, like dinosaur bones. Dinosaur bones are supposed to be at least 65 million years old, and yet in blind tests, dinosaur bones are coming back showing they still contain radioactive carbon-14. How about diamonds? Diamonds have been shown to still contain radioactive carbon-14. Diamonds, dear friends, if you haven't figured this out, diamonds are pretty hard things, aren't they? You can cut glass with a diamond. Radioactive carbon did not leach into those diamonds. Those diamonds are containing carbon-14 because that's when the diamond was forming, the radiocarbon was being trapped in there, in that matrix, okay? And that is your proof positive that diamonds don't take millions of years to form either. I mean, I had a discussion with a jeweler in Winnipeg a few years ago, and I asked him about synthetic diamonds. Can we grow diamonds artificially? Can we do it? He said, absolutely, we can do it. No problem. Friends, you got to disabuse yourself of this false idea that certain geological features of this planet absolutely require millions of years. They absolutely do not require millions of years. There's actually nothing on this planet and nothing in outer space that requires millions or billions of years, okay? Just one large-scale catastrophe, for example, like Mount St. Helens and other big catastrophes, can alter the geology in stupendous ways, in unspeakably great ways. And that's what we're trying to show here, okay? Fossilization, we saw, doesn't take millions of years. Ancient fossils are not supposed to contain carbon-14. They do. Carbon-14 and other radioactive dating methods are just they are not reliable guides to ascertaining the age of anything. And in fact, we saw that. They get lots of wild dates, and you go back to the geologic column to check those dates. And the whole thing is circular. This is what I tried to hammer on when we started this museum tour a few episodes ago. It's all circular. You have a faith commitment to Darwin and to his views about the age of the earth, to earth history. You have a faith commitment to Darwin and to uniformitarianism. You have a faith commitment that the earth is actually much, much older than what the Bible says. And you need that great age to get one kind of animal to evolve into another kind of animal. When we get over to the human evolution display, you're going to see this in spades. Just as an example, you've got the Tong fossil. This thing was discovered in 1924 by Ray Dart. And by looking at the fossil, he deduced that the creature must be between 2 and 3 million years old. Why? Because that creature is supposed to be our ancestor, but it is quite ape-like in its appearance. In fact, it's almost indistinguishable from a baby chimpanzee. But to get a creature that looks almost like a chimpanzee to evolve into a human, it's going to take maybe 2.5 or 3 million years to get that to happen, right? Well, since 1924, all the way into the early 1970s, I don't think there was a missing link that got as much press as that fossil did. So much was written on it. It was the star character in the human evolution story. But guess what happened in 1973? In 1973, the place where the skull was extracted from was given a radiometric age of less than 1 million years. In fact, 2 different independent radiometric dating techniques were applied, and it came back the skull could not possibly be 2 to 3 million years old. It had to be less than 1 million years. That is not nearly enough time for that skull to represent a legitimate ancestor of human beings. That's not enough time to evolve from that creature to Homo sapiens sapiens. So what did they do? Well, they moved that skull on a branch of the human family tree that went to extinction. But guess what happened? In 1985, they found another skull that looked even more ape-like, and it was given the same age. What are you going to do with that Tong fossil now? It was quietly slipped back into the human family tree. We're not talking about its morphology anymore, and we're not talking about its age anymore. And in fact, one very famous paleontologist or paleoanthropologist said that the date for the Tong fossil is between 2 and 3 million years, basically because we need it to be. And he said this is quite circular, and the true age of that fossil remains uncertain. And yet, if you open up an anthropology textbook, a physical anthropology textbook, you're going to see that fossil in there. The whole thing is circular. It is based on somebody's ideas, and you accept by faith those ideas or not. I choose to accept the biblical record on faith. Why do I do that? Because as we discussed in earlier programs, the God that wrote that Bible reveals himself in that Bible, and he is the only rational foundation for knowledge, for morality, for the validity of the scientific enterprise. God gives us the necessary preconditions of intelligibility. God is the only one that can make sense out of the success-generating quality of science or the intelligibility of human experience. He's the only one who can do that. You cut God out of your worldview, there goes the validity of thought, there goes the intelligibility of human experience, there goes science, the whole scientific enterprise. It goes out the window. It can't be justified. It's very, very expensive, don't you see, to jettison God from your worldview. So I accept what the Bible says on faith because it preserves rationality and it encourages scientific investigation. It makes sense out of reason, science, and ethics. And when you do that, you can begin to interpret the world in a way that it makes sense. Things cohere together, and I will say this at the end of this program, because we're going long now. If you accept what the Bible has to tell you, it will fill your life with hope. That's what we desperately need in our day and age, hope for the future. The Bible guarantees it. If you will exercise faith in Jesus, enter into that love-trust relationship with Jesus Christ, you will have hope for today and for the future, okay? All right, friends, I'm going to wrap up this program. Thank you very much for tuning in. God bless you. I look forward to visiting with you next time. Until then, you take care now, and God bless you.